to the Web3 Prof podcast.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with Roger Huang, who is the author of Would Mao Hold Bitcoin and contributor with Forbes. Thanks for being with me here today.
Jarrett, love to be on the show. And looking forward to our discussion. Thanks for the invite.
Well, you're welcome. So let's start things off with telling me a little bit about your history. How did you get into crypto?
Yeah, I started writing about it as early as 2014, and most people don't really know this. I was born in China, and then I moved back and forth between Canada. I really grew up in Montreal, but then I was always spending some time in China. And Montreal actually has like some of the OG Bitcoiners, Blockstream's co-founders. One of them was from Montreal, so there was also the Bitcoin Embassy, which is kind of one of the first physical spaces to really discuss Bitcoin. This is like 2013, 2012. So yeah, let's put that all together. And I'd been interested, we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, but because of the whole going back and forth between China and Canada, there's a lot of interesting things that happen there. There's some digital walls and great firewalls and things like that. So I've been thinking about the space, and then, there was all this like activity in Montreal, and there were Bitcoiners that were out and about, and it just got me so curious. I started writing about it, and that's how I started with it.
But why did you get, what was the initial interest point? Was it because you were a libertarian, or was it because you were trying to think about freedom, or you wanted to get rich, or you were into tech? What was that initial thing?
Yeah. I think it's one of those things where it's like in hindsight, you see it all, but as it's developing, it's very messy. But the way I like to think about it is I stumbled onto my problem was that I knew how scary digital repression was. And I think that was maybe a little bit before the curve, because if you don't spend a lot of time in countries, not to say, the United States, Canada have a lot of wonky things going on. There's a lot of surveillance, things like that. But in China, you do live in a context where it's like right in front of your face. Like you can't have access to certain content. You need to use a VPN and things like that. And so I think what really drove me in there is like, can Bitcoin be a hedge to this, right? Like, and it's not just Bitcoin, by the way. It's kind of my broader interest in freedom tech is the idea, because I was seeing people who are outside of China who are terrified about talking about Chinese politics or things. And we're talking about like, people in Canada and the diaspora, people wearing masks because they thought they were so afraid of the Chinese surveillance apparatus, and rightfully so in many ways, right? And that
were these Chinese people?
Yeah, they're Chinese people. They're Chinese people who had, some of them were like, I think foreign exchange students that were coming over, and the embassy and the consulates and other students actually kind of like surveil each other. It's kind of a little weird system, but I met them in contexts where it would not have been good. Like, for example, Tiananmen Square commemorations and things like that. And they had like full masks, like voice modulators. Like you see now the Bitcoiners have embraced that, but even the average Chinese person, so I wouldn't say average, but maybe like some members of the diaspora were already way ahead of that, right?
Wow.
So that was that initial spark of like, well, can we find ways to be outside the system? Can we transact? Can we communicate, right? To me, for example, like even communicating with China sometimes is pretty difficult. And then if you think about just all the freedoms that we take for granted and how that applies to that context, Bitcoin plays a really interesting role.
So you're obviously interested in freedom, which is really important, and Bitcoin kind of being a tool of financial freedom. How do you look at state control and Bitcoin offering some level of freedom from a controlling state like China, or maybe something softer, maybe something that we experience in the Western world?
Yeah, look, I am someone who's like really, really deep in the rabbit hole on this because I spent a lot of time thinking about it. Maybe too deep. I'll try to get a little bit, a surface layer up. And Bitcoin is a tool. It's a very good tool in some settings. I think that, what we're seeing now is just so interesting. We can probably talk our ears off about this later on, but just not even the United States, actually Hong Kong is embracing Bitcoin ETFs. So there seems to be some kind of, Bitcoin, the brand, Bitcoin, the actual technological tool, Bitcoin, the financial asset, right? And these all interplay in this narrative of state control and technology. For me, I'm really interested in like the use of Bitcoin really like peer-to-peer, community-driven, off-exchange, where you're really talking with your peers and you're really outside the system versus like if you're just holding your Bitcoin on an exchange or if you're, holding your Bitcoin on some kind of service, right? That to me isn't as interesting,
Why is that?
Well, so I think that I like to think of Bitcoin a little bit. There's some differences, but it's a little bit like email in a way of thinking. And at the beginning, email, a lot of the cypherpunks actually had their roots in making email sovereign in the sense of they were running their own computers, their own servers to do email, and then they were building privacy tooling like remailers. And remailers were basically this way for you to be able to email someone and then to hide, that chain of provenance. And we use some of that. I say we Bitcoiners use some of that logic in when you think about the Lightning Network, which is a semi-private kind of way of transacting. It relies on still some of that logic. The thing that happened with email, unfortunately, and I wonder if Bitcoin might suffer that fate eventually, is it was captured by companies that were able to provide convenience in exchange for you giving up your sovereignty and your ability to control how you show up, what data sets you show up in, and everything else. To me, Bitcoin, I'm more interested in, I might be a small minority, but I'm more interested in the people who are on the edges here, right? And really the people running these servers, and because you can run Bitcoin in a very self-sovereign way. You can run nodes, you can do things so that you are effectively your own bank, right? This isn't most people, but these are the people I kind of gravitate to. And my hope is that, people who are kind of the conviction that I share, obviously my hope is that that gets out more to the mainstream and that gets out more out there.
So what's the problem with someone being part of the system if they're holding ETFs or holding their Bitcoin on a centralized exchange versus kind of this interest that you have on, having much more sovereignty?
Yeah, there's not like necessarily a problem. It's a trade-off. I mean, one thing I would say about that is you would ask me, is it the price? Is it me getting rich? And that was never really an interest of mine, but I understand why that's the interest for a lot of different people. Right? We all have different situations. I've written for Bitcoin media outlets for a very long time, and I can tell you almost exactly how many people are interested in the price and how many people are not interested in the price when it comes to Bitcoin. And I would say like 95% of people are interested in the price.
Okay.
And it makes sense. It's just Bitcoin is a better money. It also makes sense that, the price is what matters to a lot of people because that's the thing that they are dealing with in their day-to-day lives, right? I don't necessarily think it's a problem, but I do think it's a trade-off. And I think if you don't understand the trade-off, that's where I think it's a problem. So obviously the ETFs and everything else, they give you exposure to Bitcoin's price. So if you are interested in Bitcoin because you're like, oh, I think Bitcoin is going to appreciate in price and you're using the ETF, that's fantastic, whatever. Like you do you. You don't share the same utilities and preferences as I do, but I live in a world where that's okay, right? Or at least my mental state is that's okay. I think where it becomes a problem is when people don't realize the trade-offs. And so the worry I have a little bit is that there's Bitcoin the brand. And you toss out these like really big words like decentralization and censorship proof and all these other things, right? So my worry is that some people buy Bitcoin assuming that they're going to have all these properties inherent to it, but they need to do a little bit more work for that to be actually true.
Yeah. So if we look at like 95% of people being interested in Bitcoin because of price, they're looking to obviously, increase their wealth. Would you say that means that there is a very small portion of the population that has that their main problem is censorship, or their main problem is government control, or their main problem is these other things that Bitcoin solves, but their main problem really is just like they don't have enough money or poverty or lack of wealth? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I get what you're kind of saying there. I think it's so one thing for me is that Bitcoin, for people who are in like a conventional financial system, if you believe in that system, then you don't have a problem. Right. So, but censorship is a very interesting term because the way that we think about censorship in the Western context, it may be the case that that's a smaller minority. But of course, those minorities can become large numbers. And we saw this, I mean, in Canada. Of course, the conventional banking system was disrupted because of the trucking protests. Regardless of your opinions of, whether the protests were legitimate or not legitimate or whatever, the fact is the government froze people's funds and triggered an emergency statute, right? And, I think that you're going to see more and more instances of this. So, buyer beware. You don't have to be Julian Assange for them to go after, all of your transactions and everything like that. But, in other countries, what's really interesting is like censorship is like access to different financial systems. And, because I wrote a book about China, this is like really fresh to me. Like you can perhaps consider in some definitions. I mean, censorship, again, I say it's an interesting word because the definition can be very malleable. And it is a little bit of a floating concept of sorts. Like it has a very strict definition, but what some people see as censorship, some others might not. Right. Some people might think that's legitimate and all those other things. In the Chinese context, what's interesting is that by law, there are restrictions on how they interface with even the Western financial system or TradFi. And even their ability to buy US dollars. So you see this in a lot of different countries, by the way, outside of the conventional financial system, where like they don't have access to US banking or Canadian banking. Here, I think we have the luxury of deciding like, hey, we're going to plank our savings in a Canadian or US-based banking system, right? And we're going to save in a currency that is depreciating. We are getting robbed. But we are getting robbed slower than other people. And for some people, like Argentina's 2024 inflation CPI, I think quarterly, like during October was something like 243%, right? So, and for those people, it's like an existential thing, right? They're like, oh, wow, and they can't get access to like banking in a US dollar account unless they, qualify under certain conditions. So this becomes more real. And it's a wider censorship than you would assume, right? I think in the censorship context now, just to get a little bit more specific, we might be talking a little bit more of censorship as in like, you've spoken out against the government, and so therefore you've got your funds cut off. That has happened. We've just given two really specific examples, Julian Assange and the trucking protests. But, the censorship I see outside in the world is almost like, for example, in China, you can only get certain amounts of your money out of the Chinese system. It's explicitly controlled in that way. And that's
what is that amount?
50,000 USD a person a year. They've kind of like played around with and the other thing is like you have to like basically send a letter in, and you can get like above it. We actually talked about this off before the podcast, but I actually think it's really interesting how it drives the global economy. So for example, like one of the exemptions is you can write in to the administrative organism and say like, hey, I need foreign currency because I'm planning to go to New York City. I'm really planning to ball out. I'm really planning to get some tourism and stuff like that. So, I'm sure it's not a surprise for you, especially for what you teach and things like that, that Chinese people have a high affinity for luxury goods. But, some of it starts to make a little bit more sense if you think about it in that way too. I'm not saying that's like the main reason that, people can trip out in Balenciaga. But I am saying that like when you're seeing these lineups of people at the Louis Vuitton store and you're like, oh, wow, there's like a lot of Chinese seeming people that are like, buying up all these LV bags and stuff like that. It's a lot of LV bags. I had this one time I was at the airport. I watched this one woman. She bought like the entire store. Really? Like basically. She's like bought one of each bag. I was like, this is kind of crazy. This is nuts.
And so why do you think that is? Is she actually like, is this a business for her, or is she just love LV stuff?
No, but I mean, see, that's the thing. Like, maybe she just loves LV bags, but I want to point out that if you did not know about the censorship part, then it would be harder for you to understand why this is happening. But one reason why is because, like luxury goods represent a way out of the Chinese financial system, right? So that is the thing. And there are these like really active resale markets in China for these kind of luxury goods. So, like you can think about it in terms of, there's the demand function, but there's also this really strange kind of almost like demand of like assets outside of the Chinese system, right? And it is a way to get funds out of the Chinese system as well.
So with China banning Bitcoin mining and various different language around that over the years, and often making headlines in past years, we don't seemingly hear about it as much as we used to. What lessons can we draw from the Chinese bans, and how they will affect other nations, and how important decentralization is in these scenarios?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and the way I frame it is that China is a really good red team. So what does red team mean? In cybersecurity, you have this concept where you have a really, really good adversary that's going against you and testing your defenses. And so, again, when we're talking about these words like decentralization, censorship proof, what does that really mean? Well, it doesn't really mean anything unless you see it tested out in the wild, right? I mean, there's the theory of it and there's the practice.
Yeah.
China has done a lot of the practice. And so just picking up back on one thing you said, the amount of bans has decreased, or China has not really done. I'd actually be surprised if they were to announce like further restrictions going forward. I've written a lot about it actually recently for Forbes, where I was basically came to the conclusion that I think China is going to either stay kind of flat, or they might actually do like study groups or something on Bitcoin, because there was a point in time where obviously it was a meme. It was like China's banned Bitcoin like 1,000 times. How many more times can it be banned? And I'm here to tell you that it can be banned more, but I don't think the Chinese government's going to do quite that.
How is it currently banned? Like, what can't Chinese people do with Bitcoin?
Yeah, exactly. So now we're getting into like the nuts and bolts of like the system, right? So one thing you alluded to is that Bitcoin mining is banned. But however, not only did that not really affect Bitcoin mining as a whole on a global level, because what happened is after the bans, hash rate decreased, but now we're at all-time highs, and all that hash is now like geographically, I think, located outside of China. So, China had this really interesting position where, because the mining chips were built and still are largely built by Chinese-based companies, and because China has the most electricity in the world, right? Most mining was probably physically located in China. But with the mining bans, they kind of, and the mining bans, basically the way it worked is each province had like different jurisdictions and different kind of like things where, they would fine you, or they would like, do different things if they might arrest you or something if you were operating a Bitcoin mining scheme. They arrested one of my favorite stories. They arrested a official who was basically running an unofficial Bitcoin mining company. He's in life imprisonment for like bribery and larceny, or something like that. Or don't quote me on the exact statute, but basically for bribery. And a lot of the Bitcoin miners just left, because it got pretty scary. Like one of the regions, Inner Mongolia, had like a tip line, like report your neighbors if you think they're mining Bitcoin. Of course, like the Chinese grid is, pretty monitored, so I'm sure they could have picked up some instances. But what's interesting about that is we just talked about how Bitcoin actually became stronger after the bans. I don't know that the Chinese party state was looking to kill Bitcoin or anything like that by like trying to get Bitcoin mining out. I really think where it came from was like it was a regulatory meeting, and the Chinese party state, the official at the time, was just really like evaluating Bitcoin as like something that had come up. Like the Chinese policymakers have been signaling that they want to restrict it. They were probably thinking about it more in terms of like, this thing is using a lot of electricity and we want to manage our electricity a little bit better. I don't know that they were like, we should kill Bitcoin. But if it was an attempt to try at killing Bitcoin, and we saw like, even if there was a nation where most of the Bitcoin mining was located and most of the chips were located, Bitcoin network adjusted within a matter of months. And now it's like way past that, right? And now we live in an area where the hash is much more physically distributed, which I think is very important, actually.
So you don't think that they said this because they were trying to stop Chinese people from transacting in Bitcoin or anything like that? It wasn't really about censorship. Maybe it was more about just controlling the electricity.
The Bitcoin mining stuff, yeah, because the thing is like one thing about China, maybe your listeners don't really know, is that Bitcoin is regarded as property in the courts. And so it's upheld. Like the Chinese government is not going to seize your Bitcoin if they prove that you have Bitcoin. They will do that if they think you're using it as a currency. So the Chinese state is kind of very, very focused on a couple of different elements of Bitcoin, but they're not like, it's not a whole of Bitcoin approach. I mean, one way to think about this is that I just don't think Xi Jinping thinks that much about Bitcoin. And I think as Bitcoiners, we might over kind of index on how much Bitcoin plays a role in these kind of discussions. But remember, the guy's got a lot of other things on his plate too, right? So, yeah, like I don't think it was for censoring transactions, but there are other bans that were more about that. Like, so for example, there's also an exchanges ban. And so there is no public yuan to Bitcoin pairing, and it is illegal to trade for Tether and Bitcoin. People have been arrested for that. And especially people who are willing to sell Bitcoin and Tether, as merchants for Chinese people, buyers in the Chinese banking system. But, what's interesting about both of these bans is not only did they not have the effect of really globally, like Bitcoin has never been stronger by any kind of metric, right? But it actually didn't seem to really affect what was happening in China. So one thing I wrote about is in Chain Analysis, for example, has done some, I'm not the biggest fan of them, but they have done some analysis of, how demand from China, because they have pre-existing relationships with kind of what are called over the trading counter desks. So kind of like private banks for Bitcoin, if you can think about it that way. And those are kind of a proxy for, or a floor for how much Bitcoin demand is coming in from China. And that number, probably the best quantitative number for Bitcoin demand from China, just continues to go up. Like I think it's 4x where it is, or at least 4x what it was back in 2021. Like the bans initially dampened some of the activity, but we're seeing that pick right back up. And same thing with Bitcoin mining, actually, because there are still miners. I've had some sources tell me that there's still mining happening in China.
But why are they not getting shut down or fined? Or they're just good at hiding?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that are happening here. I think like the first thing kind of speaks to Bitcoin as kind of like what it means to be decentralized, right? So we talked about the hash rate, and yeah, the reality is you can plug a bunch of miners in like anywhere in the grid. I mean, it will show up in the grid if you're doing it at a large enough scale. But there's always different kind of arrangements you can make around that. And what I think is happening is that two things. One is that when all this ban stuff came in, it was kind of like a lot of fury and noise all at once. But then since then, as you've alluded to, the Chinese government has not really kind of gone back on that, right? So there was kind of like this like flurry of activity in 2021, and then afterwards it's been kind of like a trickle. Like there have been some teams working on different things that have been arrested. There have been some officials arrested and things like that. What I think is happening, Daniel Batten actually wrote a report, and I have my own sources that I can't really talk about too much on here, but Daniel Batten actually had one miner that was publicly willing to go on record that is still mining in China, and 3 that I think didn't. Oh, wow. And generally what I can gather is that there's probably deals with like local officials, right, or private power companies or things like that. Yeah. And I think this speaks to 2 things. Like one is the economics of Bitcoin just makes so much sense. Like even if you can slap restrictions on there if you want, but you're a Chinese provincial official and you have a lot of stranded power and you're tasked with the central government to elevate poverty. Bitcoin is an incredible tool for you. Right. And this is also true in Africa and other different countries, right? So it'll take a lot more than a legal ban to like actually stop that behavior. You're just trying to like incentivize you were trying to de-incentivize what would actually be like perfectly sensible economic behavior. Right. But then the other thing is that I think that, this just speaks to like the uniqueness of how Bitcoin is built in a way so that there can't really be choke points. Like it's very... That's the one thing I really admire about Bitcoin is like the design is meant to tend towards removing choke points at all points of, and we still have those choke points. We can talk about that. The computing chips, for example, are very centralized in many ways. Mm-hmm. But in this specific example, the Bitcoin mining, for example, like nothing stops people from just plugging into the grid and plugging out, plugging in, plugging out. And you don't have to identify who you are necessarily. I mean, you have to send some identifying features, but you can kind of choose that a little bit. And you can choose to mine in different contexts. And so, for example, the Chinese mining pools are not allowed to serve Chinese IPs. But that's easy enough to get around. And people have been doing that. They have been getting around that. Yeah.
So in your book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin, you explore this historical perspective on money and also looking at control. So if Mao were alive today, how do you think he would approach Bitcoin? Would it be full suppression of Bitcoin? Would it be something else, something in between? Like, what do you actually really think?
Yeah, my one thing about the book is I wish it could have been called Would Deng Xiaoping Hold Bitcoin, but nobody knows who he is outside of China. Okay. It feels like. So unfortunately, we have to go back all the way to Mao. But I appreciate the question. Look, I think Mao did a couple of things. Like, he was aware of inflation as a force, as a reason for partially why he was able to beat the nationalist government and gain power in the first place, right? Back in the time when Mao ascended to power, they were a rebel group, and some of them were fighting out in caves and stuff like that. I think that's when he would have for sure used Bitcoin. And they were using their own alternative currencies anyways to the nationalist kind of controlled currency. But the nationalist controlled currency had a lot of problems. And one of the problems was it just wasn't worth that much, and it was inflating a lot. And you were seeing basically kind of similar things to like Weimar Germany. There's a presentation I give, and there's like this girl who's holding like the amount of currency that was equivalent to about like 10 USD at the time, and it's like 444,000 Chinese yuan or something.
It's like a big stack.
It's like a huge stack, yeah. And you know the same thing with like the wheelbarrows of like paper money and everything like that. So one of the first things Mao did is he put the central bank together. He actually collected all the regional central banks and kind of put that together under his rule. And the People's Bank of China has since then, unlike other countries, been completely subordinated to the political party and the state.
Is that not what we would expect in a communist country?
Well, it's funny because now China's communism has seen some amount of like liberalization post-Mao. Right. It's certainly what you would have seen or expected from Mao, who said power comes out of the barrel of a gun, right? He understood, I think, the thing that Mao really understood there, and this is why my answer now, when you ask me would Mao hold Bitcoin, I'm like, Mao in the rebel era probably would, and then he would probably try to kill everyone who was holding Bitcoin when he was in power, right? So that's kind of my stock answer to that. But he really appreciated the sources of power. Like, he really appreciated what keeps the state running, right? And so when you think about it, the Chinese party state under Mao, and of course, even his heirs, his successors, they've focused on two really important things: the military, political control of the military, and political control of the money, it being absolute. And, you bring up a good point. Wouldn't this be expected? But, China in post-1980s, when we talk about Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader right after Mao Zedong, did some things that you would not consider to have been done under a communist country. Like,
can you give us some examples?
Yeah, they allowed for... So under Mao, you could not run a private enterprise with more than, I think, I forget the exact number, but it's like 5 or 10 employees.
Okay.
Like, you could not have profit. You literally were assigned to a commune, and you did whatever, and you were working with party cadres, and they gave you your share.
They just like that you're going to be a farmer, you're going to be working manufacturing, and that's you just be in this commune and complete these tasks.
Yeah, I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, they had the sent down to the countryside movement, and they had all the so universities were closed for a long period.
Oh, really?
During Maoist China, yeah.
And what era are we talking about here? What years?
Yeah, more towards like the Cultural Revolution.
Okay.
Those years, yeah. So that would be 1960s, 1970s kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I know a lot of people, including members of my family, that went through that.
Really?
But I mean, that's not a very unique thing to say because a lot of Chinese people. To give you an example, Ai Weiwei's father, I'm just trying to anchor to a famous Chinese person, like was exiled to a region, I think Xinjiang at the time. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So currency and military are two areas of focus for Mao and communism control. So if Bitcoin existed, he would have eliminated it later in his years of power. Following the successors of Mao, how many have we had since Mao?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, like 4 or 5?
So just to list them out. Deng Xiaoping, and then it was Jiang Zemin. So Jiang Zemin was kind of like the post-Tiananmen Square leader. During Deng Xiaoping, there was like an era. So Deng Xiaoping actually set up the system so you would have like 10-year kind of terms. Because he suffered a lot under the Cultural Revolution, actually. Mao really like imprisoned him, cast him down, all those other things. And then Jiang Zemin kind of came to power after, so it's been 4, I think, technically. So it would be Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and then, of course, our Xi Jinping. So 4.
And have all of them progressively become more liberal or stepping away from communism since Mao?
Okay, this is this is a question that's worthy of a book in of itself. So I would suggest that people who are really interested in understanding that dynamic between the different leadership groups, like to read about each individual leader. At the highest level, what I will say is there was a tendency under Deng Xiaoping to liberalize economically. Like, so for example, to float companies on public markets. Even the People's Bank of China that we're talking about now, it's had a pretty long-standing plan to like become more and more like the Federal Reserve, in the sense that the Federal Reserve targets interest rates and uses market-based metrics. That's not something you would expect a communist country to do. You would say that, what China was doing in the past was kind of just more like, hey, the money supply should be X amount this year, right? And under Mao, they solved inflation by basically saying prices will always be this no matter what happens. Okay. And I have the guns to enforce that.
Right.
So, of course, different views. Different leaders have had different factions. Really what matters, I kind of listed to you like the paramount leader, who's like the president, but the premier also matters a lot. The premier is kind of like the number 2. And the premier tends to be the one who's responsible for the administrative state. And so responsible for like the regulations, for, the People's Bank of China, for all this other stuff. And in general, those have been more economically liberal, including under Xi Jinping. His previous premier was actually quite economically liberal. I would say that it's been kind of like a mixed record politically. There was a wave, like people were a little bit more hopeful to a certain degree that China was going, like there's this whole bet that China would economically liberalize and then politically start to give people the right for elections, be a little bit more cool with freedom of the press and things like that. Unfortunately, under Xi Jinping, what we've seen, I think, is a total reversal of that. And in many ways, even his, so he also broke the term system. So now he's gotten an unprecedented 3rd term.
Okay.
So normally he should have left power by now. But now he's actually into a new term because he's seen as such a paramount leader, right? Or he's constructed himself in the parties that way. But he's actually chosen a different premier. And his previous premier, Li Keqiang, was actually of a faction of Chinese politics that you can consider in our Western view to be more economically and politically liberal.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So I understand, and I'm speaking well beyond what my area of understanding, but I understand that China has a CBDC. And I hear stories, or we hear stories a lot of situations where people do things which is not acceptable in Chinese society, like jaywalking is the example, and somehow they are penalized through some kind of social credit system where they then, they bear the consequences of that. And I don't know what those things are. I guess it depends on how extreme their actions are, but that they can't participate in the economy. Can you bring some kind of truth to these kind of lore that we hear in Western society?
Yeah, it's a very nuanced topic. I actually devoted one chapter of my book to it. And I cited pretty heavily this resource called China Law Translate. So by all means, don't take me to be like the world expert on social credit. There's some really good resources out there. But look, the short of it is that social credit, I think there are systems that are like that, but sometimes it gets a little bit, directionally speaking, it's right. But some of it is misreported.
Okay.
Like when you see specific examples, that's when I'm a little bit more careful, because people forward me these examples of they're like, oh, like this gas station will refuse to serve gas for people under a certain number of points. And then I read it and I'm like, no, this is like a loyalty program. Right. And like stuff like that. Right. So there, like there's sometimes, but what is undisputably true is that China is constructing a surveillance state.
Okay.
Of which, so for example, there's one camera for every 2 people.
Wow.
The most cameras in the world, although the second I should point out is the United Kingdom. And there is a great firewall. There are certainly consequences attached to you for actions and at a lower scale than most people would expect. And what do I mean by that? Because that sounds like abstract,
right.
Whatever. I'll give you a really specific story. There was someone who got arrested because they tweeted "Glory to Hong Kong" and they had like 80 followers. So you can imagine in a non-Chinese context, you'd be like freaking out. And it's not that like, in the United Kingdom, there's been people arrested for whatever they're saying and all this other stuff too. I understand that. But this is, we're talking about at a scale that's like, at a lower scale. And even it's funny to me because Twitter is banned in China.
Right.
So it's like this person was not even really even tweeting to, so the Chinese security state is being built. It's intimidating, and there's a lot of data being transferred and shared between different parts. You have to assume that's the case. But whether or not it's exactly the way it's being reported on, like I just ask people to like look at sources like China Law Translate and not the short form stuff. Because short form stuff, especially the stuff which is more like memes, I think they're funny. I send those memes all the time. Someone says something a little out of pocket, like, I love mapo tofu this way, and I send them like the social credit negative 999 million, like you're gonna get executed tomorrow kind of thing. Right. That's all fun, but the real kind of mechanisms, I mean, it's a little bit like the US and Canada, actually, really, in the sense of like the machinery is really terrifying, but like it's hard to meme, but like it's all moving together in these parts, but it's not like so obvious as to like, oh yeah, that gas station suddenly is going to stop printing stuff, right? But the social credit, the way that kind of surveillance and data is being built, you can think of the central bank digital currency. And just for your listeners who don't know what a CBDC is, it's basically a direct relationship to the central bank, right? So the central bank has the ability to choose all the technology choices. They have the ability to be able to shut you off from your funds. They have the ability to be able to print funds. And we've seen this in China. So China has the world's most advanced central bank digital currency, the eCNY, the digital yuan. And they've been doing research on it since 2014. One of the reasons why they did it is because they were afraid of Bitcoin. And so the CBDC, the way it plays, it's like a layer in this form of surveillance. So you can imagine now having the ability to be able to financially surveil people. Now, one nuance is that in China that already kind of exists, and it's called WeChat Pay, and it's called Alipay.
Okay.
It's just managed by private companies. Right. And that might not be so dissimilar from how people interface with the government, even here. Like, so for example, you obviously don't think of yourself as giving all your life details to the CIA, but you are probably posting on Facebook.
Right.
Similarly, there are people in China who are all their entire lives are on mobile payments. They're on WeChat Pay. They're on Alipay. They don't even think about it. But that's all data that's getting hoovered up. The CBDC is China's way of saying like, it would be good if the government had direct access to that, right? They maybe don't want to work through the companies, although they still can. And I think that the scariest parts are really what it gives the Chinese government the ability to do, like in combination with all these things. Because that's the part where it's like the difference between a CBDC and a private stable coin or whatever. I don't love stable coins, but I also acknowledge that the stablecoin issuer doesn't have the ability to jail you.
Right.
Right. In China, you put all this together, even though the government says, trust me, we have our own internal laws and whatever, it's just, if you can't enforce it by the actual technical means, then those words, to me at least, trust, like verify, don't trust, right? Like, so the CBDCs, in the pilots, they like expired the funds if you didn't spend them.
Okay.
Right. And they also airdropped them, which I thought was also kind of funny. So imagine like the world's biggest ICO issue, right? They're like texting people because they have access to everyone's SMSs.
Oh, interesting.
And they're like, you just got this amount of money.
Yeah.
And they work with the provincial governments and kind of get that out. But, you could quickly see how that could become quite dystopian, right? And they've pulled out some stops. I mean, listen, the Chinese government has not tried the hardest it could to pump this thing out. Like, I think at an extreme, it could kind of do what like Nigeria has been doing. Like, they could really just say like cash is worthless now. They could demonetize the entire economy. They haven't done that, and there's reasons for that. They've pulled their punches on that, but it's certainly clear to me that they're trying their best to advance this. They're putting it in all the state media. They're trying to put it in all the big platforms, and it's also one of these things where they made the transaction fee 0%. So, they're trying to get merchant adoption in that way. And they can do that because of the government. So again, it's like, that's where it gets really scary. And so you can imagine a system, and I can paint it in Black Mirror terms and make it a meme, but really the machinery is terrifying. It's just more that we don't really know the specifics, actually, really. And it doesn't show itself in that obvious way. And I can bring up all these nuances in like China law translate that, like, for example, like, technically the stuff that people were freaking out about, like there were Chinese people restricted from travel, but they did have to have a default court judgment rendered against them. So that makes it a little bit easier to think of that as like bail. Right. Right. Like, so you're like, oh, it's outrageous that Chinese people were stopped because of a digital score. But then, hey, why do we have cash bail, and then you have to give your passports in if you're like convicted of something. So do you have problems with the system, or do you have problems with the statutes that are being enforced? But with China, the thing that's scary is the machinery is the most advanced. And I think it's something that other states are looking to learn from, despite their protests to the opposite. And just think about the amounts of data being collected and the amount of control that's able to put there. You can shut off people's finances for this or that. Right. At any moment. So
do people know when they're dealing with a CBDC versus regular currency? Like, is there like two accounts in your bank account? This is non-CBDC currency, and this is. Do you know what I mean? Like, how does it actually? How does the regular person actually know, or how will they know that they're actually dealing with this versus that?
No, it's really clear. So the central banks, like for example, even in looking for examples outside of China, like in India, it's branded as like an official kind of currency, right? Because that's kind of like what separates it. Okay. So it's very clear. Like there is a separate app for the ECNY. You can download it, and it has like the imagery associated with the yuan and the PBOC's logos and everything like that. So they do make it a point to make it very clear that this is ECNY and this is not. In China, the way it works is like you need to deposit money in your bank account and then link it to WeChat or Ali. Okay. So they can't like create money for you. Like they need to act. They basically give you a digital interface for you to access those funds. Yeah.
And so so people know when they interact with the digital currency. Yes. And do you think that people are Chinese people thinking, well, I'm gonna put some of my assets into the digital currency, and I'm gonna keep some of it in non-digital currency to hedge against the fact that the Chinese government knows more if I use this currency?
Yeah, I mean, look, first thing, and I should have caveated my answers with all this, like, China's vast. Right. I'm just looking at like one little part of the elephant. I always say that in everything I do, but just reinforcing that for any of your listeners. But, from my read, I think there is a lag in it. So first, one thing people should know is that the ECNY has seen really lagging adoption. Like just doesn't seem to be as much traction for it, especially for retail use cases. And I was actually looking at, I think Pierre Richard or someone had posted how many transactions Bitcoin did. And the ECNY has in its lifetime done a lot less than Bitcoin does in 1 quarter, for example. So like, still a lot of room to go ahead. It's always been a very small part of the Chinese monetary supply, like 0.17 or 0.18% or something.
Okay.
So, by no means is it like a runaway like freight train right now. It's still scary because of what it could be, but it's not quite there yet. And I think one of the reasons why that's the case is exactly what you pointed out, is that people are aware this is coming from the government. So, they've had interviews of people who have, so the South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong news outlet, currently owned by Jack Ma, who owns Alibaba, so maybe slightly biased. But but they went out and they did some research in some of the pilot cities of the ECNY. So Suzhou, I think, was the pilot city that they went to, and they just went back and they were like, "Are people still using this thing?" And people were like, no, like, I don't really use this anymore because I have WeChat Pay, I have Alipay. I don't really see the need for, one more thing. And I think it's unsaid, but I think one reason why it's the case is like, why would you add another thing that like has more direct government surveillance and privacy controls? Because, Chinese people aren't like, they're aware like the government's monitoring things, like there's censorship, and it's not like Chinese people are like passive victims in all this either, right? Like they're interfacing with their internet. Some of them are using VPNs. Some of them are posting in like ways to like get away from the censors. A lot more than you would expect.
A lot more are trying to get away from it.
Oh, there's a lot more. Well, just like on average, like VPN usage, I think like, is much higher than you would assume. And, like I think that for people, I would encourage people to just, I know most of your listeners probably won't speak Mandarin, but like, even if you use Nostr, which we can talk about, which actually auto-translates some of these things, or if you find some people in different communities to like actually tap in and see what's going on, because Chinese people are, you'd be surprised. I feel like the internet there has like more of a rebel spirit than you would assume. Same thing with Iran's internet. Those two countries have like large digital native populations that like know their way around. And yes, there have been restrictions placed on them by their government, but they're kind of like, they're not to swear on your thing, but like to shitpost is, a thing that Chinese people have mastered. And you would not assume that to be the case, maybe, if you were like him. So there is this dynamism to it. And I think that part of that is like Chinese people aren't dumb. And even though they might say to your face, like, we're not doing this because it's one other app, I mean, they're for sure thinking like, hey, it's the government's that's behind this. I don't want this directly in. One story I just want to cap off on, and what's giving me a lot of hope, is I was actually talking to someone who lived in China, grew up in China. They came out here, and then they were like, you know what? After realizing what Bitcoin was, I deleted WeChat Pay and Alipay. And I'm just off that entirely. And it's kind of, I think these stories are very rare. I'm not trying to say that this is like we're watching the revolution happen right now, but these are the stories that give me hope. If
the military and if currency is how you can control people in China, is Bitcoin a potential revolutionary tool to see the collapse of communism in China?
Yeah, that's a very nuanced question, and it's a lot of people ask me this. So let me preface this first by saying that China is actually the epitome of gradually then suddenly. I always start there because people who aren't as aware of Chinese history, and I spent the first chapter of my book covering Chinese history actually because of this. They probably aren't aware that the Chinese people have literally created revolutions that have like shattered, like in a matter of months, overturned thousands of years of dynastic rule, right? So this has happened before. Will it happen again? Now, we live in an age where I always use the example of Iran. Iran to me is a much weaker state, whose ideology was formed around the same time as the China of today in the late 1970s. And Iran is weaker because they don't have access to financial resources. They don't have access to foreign exchanges. They are dependent on other countries, including China, for manufacturing. But they've still tested they've still, despite a lot of external pressure and direct sanctions, the regime is still the Ayatollah who is ruling right now has been the same, Khatami, for the last 30 years or so, since Khomeini died in 1989. So I always find Iran and China really interesting because they kind of went through. What's so fascinating to me is that they were both the China of today is not Mao's China perfectly, and the China today was really birthed after Mao's death. And it was around that like 1970s period. And then Iran too was birthed in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And in fact, the reform and opening up period, which we briefly described, which was kind of that economic and political liberty, Deng Xiaoping and everything. I encourage people to read biographies of Deng Xiaoping if they're interested in more. Was around that same time as well. And then China had Tiananmen Square in 1989. And Iran had, the death of Khomeini, who was the original kind of religious leader. And despite all this, Iran, which you would assume, using all this analysis, like, hey, maybe there's going to be a revolt, and that has had several revolutions, for example, the Green Revolution, has still not fallen. So how do I piece this together? Well, there's gradually, not then suddenly, the Chinese people have been capable of volcanic change when you least expect it. But at the same time, we live in an era where even in countries that would have less firmer control over everything, seem to still persist, right? A lot of us who were born after the 90s have not seen a hyperpower, superpower collapse in the way that China would, for example. Like, we haven't seen that in the last 30 or 40 years. This is like kind of like a generational epoch. And so that might actually be even more of a generational thing. As for Bitcoin's role in all of this, if I were to sum up what I just said, like, I don't really know, but the Chinese people have been capable of change in ways that would surprise you. So never discount that. And where I see Bitcoin playing a role, so I might have talked with you about this, but I actually went to Hong Kong during the protests, and I was doing some coverage on Bitcoin's relationship with the protests. And I was trying to understand, the cleanest narrative would have been to have found someone that said, we are using Bitcoin as a group in order to hedge against the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong police. And instead, I found a much more complicated story. There were all the prerequisites for that to happen because, in fact, the protesters realized that the Hong Kong police were tracking them through digital transit cards. In Hong Kong, there's this thing called the octopus card, which is very similar to, I don't know what the SkyTrain cards are, but whatever that is in Vancouver. Yeah. And they stopped using that. They started using cash. And there was a movement to divest from the Hong Kong dollar there was that direct. Sometimes protesters don't really get that, I think. And in Hong Kong, they really understood it. They were like, in order for us to meaningfully protest our government, we actually have to attack the government where the government cares the most. And what does the government care the most about? The military and the money. Sometimes you have these protests. I'm not going to go wildly out of scope with this, but you have people protesting and they're like perfectly happy being taxpayers of the same country that's committing the things that they're protesting. So I'm always very confused by that. Yeah. But anyways, the Hong Kongers really got it. But so you would have thought that, oh, hey, this is like a perfect situation. You all should be using Bitcoin, right? And for transactions between each other. And as a way to like basically hedge against the Hong Kong government that you're protesting right now. That did not really happen at scale. At least not when I was there. And I wrote a story about how like the price might have increased locally a little bit. I asked the ATM providers, hey, are you seeing an uptick in Bitcoin demand? They were like, no, because everybody's protesting. So all of our ATMs are occupied.
Interesting.
Yeah. Hong Kong's if you've ever been, Hong Kong's a very dense place. Yeah. And so when the protests were happening, it was like madness. It was even more dense than it normally is. And Hong Kong's already a very compact place. So, there wasn't a lot of that. I did write a story. Genesis Block, which was one of the OTC trading desks, actually was providing water bottles to protesters. They fundraised with that using Bitcoin Cash. Not Bitcoin, but Bitcoin Cash.
And when you say they're giving water bottles, as in they were branded Waterboard's promoting their OTC desk?
They kind of had this thing where it was, so the protest color was like yellow. So it was like yellow, and then it said that it came from Bitcoin Cash, or like it was kind of like, it was from Genesis Block and all that. So I wrote about that. And apparently, actually, after I wrote about it, I heard about this through the grapevine. I mean, Genesis Block, if you're listening to this, let me know. But apparently they refused to do press after that story came out. Because I imagine the consequences were probably not that great for them.
Oh, really?
Well, because I wrote a story about how they were supporting the protesters directly.
So then the Communist Party came down on them.
Well, I don't know if the Communist Party... Well, so the Hong Kong protests, I mean, that whole... I mean, it's probably going to be too long for me to explain it all in detail, but
Sure.
the Hong Kong government is an extension
of
the central government. So I refer to central local government kind of. So the Hong Kong government did go after people. Basically, the central government, the CCP, put in a national security law that made a lot of things like freedom of the press, you can argue, and other things like basically punishable by jail or fines. Right. And so there was a new category of violations of laws. And that's kind of how they went after people who were supporting the protests or who were protesting themselves.
Do you see Bitcoin, because it's neutral?
Yeah.
And sometimes I find it challenging when politicians talk about Bitcoin because it sometimes removes its neutrality. People now view Bitcoin as a conservative thing because Donald Trump talks about it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think, personally, I feel like that's unfortunate because Bitcoin, I think, is neutral. It doesn't have a political opinion. Do you see that Bitcoin can be leveraged by authoritarian states to do what they want to do, as well as the commonly held view is that it commonly creates freedom for people? But can it help authoritarian states, do the business that they want to do in order to suppress people?
Yeah, let me link that back a little bit to your question of Bitcoin's role as any potential revolutionary role. What I always point out to people is that Bitcoin, for Chinese people at least, is an anchor out of the system, right? It's they're forbidden from that. And again, when we talk about the Chinese state, they care about two things: the military and the money. And this is a way for Chinese people to skirt the money controls and to get out of the system and into something that will give them positive returns. And not because they're huge ideologues or they want the party to go down now, but because the party has created a system where the mandate of heaven is now. It's GDP growth. If you're not doing GDP growth, you're not satisfying my requirements, right? And so if I want to get out of this system, so basically in China right now, you have the freedom to earn money, but you can't spend it outside. Now, taking that answer, and the role that Bitcoin can play against authoritarians. If you're asking me, can Bitcoin be leveraged by authoritarians? My answer to that is also yes. Bitcoin is a tool, and some of the things that I mentioned to you, like this is where, remember the initial conversation we had about, the trade-offs. This is where it really matters that you understand what you're bargaining in for. Because, for example, Hong Kong, as we mentioned throughout this, has actually embraced Web3 and has embraced spot Bitcoin ETFs. And you might wonder, well, why would that be the case? And that is a state leveraging Bitcoin for its purposes, the marketing of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin has been such an exponentially growing financial asset. It has now become really popular amongst ETF issuers. And we've seen the largest ETF issuances in history. And other countries are watching. And Hong Kong watched this and said, we have a problem, which is the exact opposite of the problem I just told you about, which is that there's not foreign direct investment in. People are trying to get out. So how do we get people in? Well, we can do a Bitcoin ETF, right? So I would almost say that's like a counterposition of, you can say, an authoritarian government leveraging Bitcoin. And that's where I think it's so important to understand the difference between Bitcoin, the brand, and what you're actually getting. Because when you're buying Bitcoin ETFs from the Hong Kong government or from the US government, I'm not actually trying to make it like a government thing, no matter what government it is, you are buying something that is completely in their wheelhouse. It's the issuers are, regulated by different laws. And in the case of Hong Kong, for example, the Bitcoin has to be held in exchanges that are regulated by Hong Kong. And so, Bitcoin is a tool. And if we're not careful about making these trade-offs and understanding why these trade-offs matter, yes, they can be leveraged by authoritarians, just like they can be leveraged for liberty.
Just to get back to the mechanics, I just want to clarify something. So if I'm a person living in mainland China, from what I understand, from what you said, I cannot, there's not an exchange mechanism where I can go and get a hold of Bitcoin that I can custody. Is that correct?
There's not an, okay, well, so first, the Hong Kong Bitcoin ETFs, you're not allowed to invest in them if you're from the mainland.
Okay.
So that's one thing.
Yep.
They did split the wall between mainlanders and Hong Kong.
Okay.
The second thing is, there isn't like a legal way for you to do that.
Okay.
Now, there are many ways for you to do that.
Yeah.
And
obviously peer-to-peer is one way in which we could do that.
Peer-to-peer is one way.
Yes.
So the problem I have a little bit is in doing research on this, it's really much a gray zone. It's a gray area. So basically what I've seen is a lot of instances of people buying off of what we call these over-the-counter trading exchanges. There are also, and I've talked with anecdotally, like peer-to-peer groups that exist. But of course, some of the beauty of Bitcoin is that we just will not know.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I will say is that China has probably a very high concentration of people, because going back to what we said, a lot of the early miners were in China.
Right.
So if you think about all the Bitcoin that is in China today, could be quite a significant amount that we don't know about. And what happened to that Bitcoin? I mean, I've gotten some anecdotal glimpses at that, but you really don't know. That's kind of part of the point.
I guess what I'm asking is, like, can a Chinese person set up an account with a centralized exchange, connect it to their bank account, wire the money to a centralized exchange, and get Bitcoin? And then from that centralized exchange, transfer it to a wallet which they custody, and then take that custodied Bitcoin, fly to Canada or America and exchange it for US dollars or whatever. Is that an exit from the system, or is that actually so complicated because of so many firewalls and things like that, that that's not actually realistically possible?
No, it's very realistically possible. And it's why there's a lot of mainland Chinese people who are involved. Like, people might be confused because you're hearing everything I'm saying. But they're like, I went to Bitcoin Asia and there's like a ton of mainland Chinese people.
Right.
Or there's all these mainland Chinese people who are buying things, or they're running L2 companies, or they have a bunch of Bitcoin, or like things like that, right? So you might be trying to square that. And the answer to that is, it's like fairly, so it's very similar to the way China manages VPNs. Mm-hmm. In the sense that approximately, maybe I would guess 10 to 20% of Chinese people are using VPNs. Okay. Right? And technically it's illegal.
Yeah.
But it's like a little bit like, I mean, when Vancouver used to enforce against weed, I don't know, like people, it's like really hard to do that. So in practice, what you really do in China is you go and find the people who are doing this at scale. Mm-hmm. And so in China, there's a few ways. There's the peer-to-peer groups. That I think that's more like the OGs. So if you're in an OG community, you might have peer-to-peer trading groups. There's been some reporting about how like people trade in like laundromats and all this other stuff. I don't think it's a huge amount, but it definitely happens. Mm-hmm. And it's still part of like the Bitcoin system that can happen. The ultimate hedge. But the majority of people actually seem to buy from one of two places. One is just they use exchanges. They just put that there. I mean, the exchanges are not as Binance is probably famously known for not so super strict on getting new users. Like, yes, there's regulations, and they kind of try to play their way around that, right? So if you've heard about the Binance Angels.
No.
So the Binance Angels was why Binance got into trouble with the states.
Okay.
Because the Binance Angels were kind of this team. It was kind of like a wink wink thing where it's like, well, we, do a bunch of like KYC, AML stuff. So if you're from the States, you really should not be on the platform. Mm-hmm. But if you're from the States and you really want to be on the platform, wink wink, just so you know, there's these things called VPNs. Okay. Right? Yeah. So, there was like an angel team that's kind of responsible for that. And Binance really learned that from China. And brought that out to like the whole, because even as early as like, 2017, 2018, there's starting to be all these restrictions, right? 2013 were some of the earliest restrictions. And so you had all the tricks of the trades. Like I've talked to a lot of people who've done different things. Like you could have, like your mileage will vary as to how much this works now and then. But in general, like even putting like a Hong Kong address, or, you have to put in like a passport of some kind, but you can also get like, there's like a way to get like I forget what country it was, but they were selling like passports for like $1,000 or something.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You can put like whatever address. You can be a Chinese citizen. If you live in Canada, they'll still serve you.
Right.
Right. So there's all these workarounds for like buying from an exchange.
Yeah.
But nowadays, I think the exchanges don't necessarily want to take that risk or openly flaunt the Chinese government. So normally, it's actually quite a smart system. What they do is they delegate. And I wrote an article about this called How Chinese People Are Buying More Bitcoin, if people are interested in really diving deep into the mechanism. But basically, there's like these over-the-counter merchants. Who knows who they are? But they will give you like Tether or Bitcoin. It's mostly Tether, by the way, because Tether has a lower spread. And then you use it. Most people, sadly, in my opinion, most people keep on exchanges, because they're looking to trade into pairs and things like that.
Yeah.
But of course, you can always withdraw from the exchanges into your wallet or other things. So, so what you just described, I mean, it's not rocket science to do.
Right.
And a lot of Chinese people have been doing it.
Yeah.
Whether through all these different methods, like death by like 1,000 cuts, in terms of these different regulations. So that's kind of what's been happening. And it's been a little bit difficult for me to keep abreast of like what's the latest thing that most people are doing. But as of the latest, I think it's mostly kind of like the OTC desk that we're talking about. They kind of pay collateral to a Binance or like a major exchange, and they're listed, but they are not Binance.
Right.
But they pay collateral, so you recognize like, oh, this is a legitimate service.
Right.
So they're using Binance or whatever for discoverability, but then Binance itself is not actually processing the payments. And I think the reason why they do that is because they don't want the Chinese government to go in and say like, hey, well, you've been selling to Chinese citizens. They if the Chinese government did find that, they would go hard. And that's why a lot of the exchanges that were traditionally China-based, like Binance obviously is one of them, moved out.
Yeah. CZ's had, not that he's with Binance anymore, but CZ's had enough problems already, eh?
CZ's got a lot of problems. CZ's actually a very similar story to mine, actually. I didn't realize this, but he went to McGill, same university as I went to, and his parents left China as well.
Didn't he go to high school here in Vancouver?
He might have.
I believe he did go to high school here in Vancouver.
He might have.
CZ, if you're listening, probably one of our most regular listeners. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Well, I mean, CZ, you should get on the pod.
Yeah, next time you're hopping through town, let me know. Roger, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think the whole landscape of China and Bitcoin and the economic authoritarian activity, your understanding of the power of guns and money, and Mao and communism is really fascinating. I think especially for someone who is kind of a regular Canadian who doesn't really have the context to understand these things certainly not deeply and even on the surface. And so I think it's really interesting for us to get an understanding of kind of the economic power of China and how some of these things affect the daily lives of individuals. I really appreciate you spending some time with me here today. Where can people learn more about you and your book?
Yeah, sure. Jared, this is a great conversation. Really appreciated you giving the time and really appreciated the incisive questions that we had here. For finding me, my preference is Nostr, but I've heard that it's kind of hard to find me. But I'm low-key, like the Norse trickster god, at nostr-verify.com. But if you also just look up my name, Roger Huang. We had a running joke, Jared and I, that I actually, you know what? I'm not going to dox myself, but I have a secret. I have a secret other name that I sometimes use. But if you look me up under my real name, Roger Huang, then yeah, you'll probably find me on Nostr. And of course, I'm on X, Roger H 1991. Just doxing my year of birth. Why not? We're out there.
Anything else you'd like to dox?
Yeah, anything else? Got my social security number and everything ready. No, and the book itself, so yeah, it's available. So if you want like just to see the first chapter, get an excerpt, I actually have a website called ChinaBitcoinBook.com. It's got a few resources that dive a little bit deeper into some of the topics we talked about as well. So that's like one place where you can get access to it. And then Amazon sells it. You can get it through Bitcoin Magazine. That store, that's how you could buy it with Bitcoin, I've heard. But probably the best is if you actually see me, dear listener. There are some copies, if you're in Vancouver, there are some copies at Funk Coffee Bar.
Oh, great.
And the Vancouver Public Library actually ordered a copy. And, I might have like one or two running around, and I'm always pretty present in some of the meetups and events. And otherwise it's, I'm around on social, and I kind of broadcast different events I'm going to, speaking at BTC Prague and like a couple of other events. So
Excellent.
love to do some direct peer-to-peer transactions there.
Yes, I love that. Thanks so much, Roger. I really appreciate you being with me here today.
All right.